Well, they had just gone through a Great Depression, and farmers were really struggling. I mean, it was dog eat dog out there.
They weren't able to make ends meet. There were a lot of farmers losing their land in the 1920s. It was a vicious circle, you know.
You know, when I was growing up, I didn't know a whole lot about Parity. In fact, I didn't know anything about Parity. What I knew about, though, was our community, how we worked together and how we lived together, and the things that brought us, that we had in common, basically.
Hi, I'm Austin, and my interest in this project relates to how farmers in rural America perceive the government by means of trust, accessibility, and transparency.
Hi, I'm Amanda, and my interest in this project stems from my background in food science. I've worked in the food and beverage industry for 8 years now, and it's never felt right that there's been such a focus on profits and profit margins. And this project allows me to explore the structural issues behind that system.
Hi, my name is Avinash. My main research interests are largely related to the Indian farmers' protest. However, I think this project is particularly important because I believe that learning from farm elders in Iowa about the U.S. movement for parity back in the 1980s is very important to kind of get a blueprint as to how Indian farmers can move ahead in their fight for MSP.
Hi, I'm Catherine. My interest in this project relates to my experience growing up in Alabama and driving through small town communities where I noticed boarded up storefronts and other signs of economic hardship. I think that this project will help me contextualize the breakdown of small town America and further understand how parity can help revitalize rural communities.
In 1926, every bank in my county seat closed its doors because farmers couldn't pay their bills. You see, World War I created a great demand for agricultural products in order to feed Europe, to feed the troops, and so farm prices were very much elevated above the normal level during World War I. And as soon as the war was over, that demand collapsed, and so did the farm prices, where farmers had taken on debt to buy land, and they had to pay very high prices for things that they had normally would use in the process of farming. Their prices crashed, and they weren't able to make ends meet. There were a lot of farmers losing their land in the 1920s, and my dad could relate to many of those situations, and he would be really teary-eyed when he would talk about how his neighbors were losing their farms back then. It was a kind of a vicious circle, you know, and this is what happens, and then they end up in a boom and bust. And of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was almost bust all the way until the New Deal came in with a way of supporting prices, actual prices in the marketplace. In 1932, the crisis was so bad back here that farmers demonstrated, and they threatened to hang judges and shoot bankers and dump milk. They were very militant. They demonstrated in ways that they thought their fellow citizens would recognize the urgency of the change.
Well, they had just gone through a Great Depression, and farmers were really struggling. I mean, it was dog eat dog out there, and that went through the Dust Bowl, and the politics. The Roosevelt years started out. He got Henry Wallace as his Secretary of Agriculture, but they knew that there was a lot of unrest out here. I mean, farmers were, they were desperate. A lot of people were desperate. They knew that family farmers, if they were going to stay on the land, that something had to be done. And they came up with this parity formula, and supply management, they needed to have that, and a grain reserve. So in case something happened out on the land, if there's drought or whatever, they could fall back on that, so they could have that, put back into the farm's hands.
I talk about the Parity programs as market management, managing markets to help farmers get justice, to get paid fairly. Left on their own, farm markets usually fail to provide farmers with a fair price. They fail on both the supply and the demand sides. The supply, the farmer side, and the demand, the consumer side. And on the farmer side, farms are only so big, and there's only so many farms and so much acreage, and so therefore the supply doesn't change much from year to year. They always plant the whole farm for a number of reasons. And on the consumer side, for example, your stomach's only so big, and so you don't change what you eat and very much based on the farm prices, and that's also true for industry, very similar. So the market management is on the bottom side, that's the main thing, is a price floor backed up by supply reductions as needed to make the price floor work effectively. So we don't have an oversupply and a lot of carryover. And then on the top side, there's another part of it, different than minimum wage and living wage, a price ceiling. And that's backed up by a reserve supply, some stored up. So in one place where we have some stored reserves, we can put on the market if the price goes too high, spikes up. And then on the other hand, we're doing the bottom side. Some might say that contradicts each other, but actually that you need both.
When I was growing up, I didn't know a whole lot about parity. In fact, I didn't know anything about parity. What I knew about, though, was our community, how we work together and how we live together, and the things that brought us, that we had in common, basically. And I think that's an important aspect of that era. It was partly, there was a lot of things going on, and certainly the viability of farms, the family farm, was a big part of it.
So I went to school here in Sheridan as a young child, in grade school in the 1950s, and Sheridan was a thriving community. A lot of towns in Greene County were thriving communities, even with towns that were actually much smaller than Sheridan. But at the time, we had a movie theater, a car dealership, 3 grocery stores. A lot of towns had more than one bank, and of course there were a lot of stores that supplied things for farmers and also bought their produce, like eggs and milk and cream. But that all disappeared over the years, and I guess things accelerated in the 2000s, early 2000s.
There was good crop rotations. We had livestock, we had chickens, we had hogs, we had cattle and dairy. Some people had sheep. And there was that balance there, and they had that supply management, and the soil was so rich, there was just a lot of economic balance there. I mean, you never heard about family farmers leaving the land. I mean, they were just out there, they were just getting good prices. And all that prices reflected into the small towns. Small towns were thriving. I mean, it was just the culture behind this, the supply management and the Parity program gave us the money to start to modernize our farms. Like I said, the economic balance was there to create that good culture, to create that solidarity out there.
Before the 1980s farm crisis, we had a few years of higher prices during the 1970s from a huge Russian grain sale, which was kept secret from the farmers until afterwards. And so the grain companies were able to buy a lot of the grain really cheap. In 1962, the report and adaptive program for agriculture from the Committee for Economic Development called for lowering price floors in order to remove quote-unquote excess resources, mainly labor, from agriculture. In other words, farmers and farm workers, to lower it down and run them out of business, which they claimed was a good thing. They said, we want to reduce the number of farmers by a third in 5 years. Not just a mild approach, but a very vigorous approach to lower the price floors. And that would be about 2 million farmers and farm workers in 5 years in their goal. So that was a big lobby influence on Congress. And over the years, we've had a number of lobbyists. There was a group that called themselves the Farm Coalition Group, and they called for no supply management, no supply reductions. They wanted to have the cheaper prices to buy. That would be those on the buying side, and those on the selling inputs to farmers' side, like Monsanto and John Deere. They were lobbying for things like, those kinds of companies were lobbying for things that did not have any reduction in the number of acres on which they could sell their products.
It's clear that big corporations like to have cheap raw materials. They like to have cheap labor. Well, it worked out just fine for them then by having cheaper agricultural products. It not only gave them cheap raw materials, but when they drove farmers off the land, they had to go to town to work, and that created more cheap labor. So it was a win-win for big corporations to get rid of parity, and we've witnessed what happens when that happens, and it's not good for our society as a whole, especially for rural America. And in order to bust that dedication to parity, which farmers had, they had to use the Cold War anti-communist hysteria to discredit farm organizations like the Farmers Union that supported parity. And so at that point, farmers felt like, well, gee, I can't be a member of Farmers Union now. I can't speak out in favor of parity, or they're going to accuse me of being a communist. And so that just left the field open for agribusiness to have their way with the kind of agricultural policy that was detrimental to family farmers. When you don't have parity, you're saying that there's going to be an evolution of your agriculture. And so some farmers are not going to be able to stay in business, which means the other farmers are going to want to have to farm their land, which means we get bigger machinery, use more chemicals, and go in debt more. And then the government, sometimes when the system is so detrimental to the farmers that exist, they will step in with government payments just to keep the whole system from collapsing. So they're all only interested in preserving the attrition that happens in an evolutionary process that eliminates family farmers. The lack of parity just meant that farm income in general was down over the years, which meant that there would be fewer farmers that could stay in business, and the dollars that they would normally spend in a diversified operation didn't circulate in the economy anymore, the local economy. So then many people would leave their local town, and their children would not be in school anymore, and the churches would close, clubs would fold, you name it. Like I said, democracy disappeared because nobody had any say in anything anymore.
And now it's kind of business, all business, There's a reason it's called agriculture, not agribusiness, okay? It's all about the culture of family farming in small towns. When they took away the parity program, they left family farmers to the mercy of the free markets here. So when you have to fight that powerful entity of big agribusiness, taking them on now, it's a real struggle. So that's what happened here. There isn't $1 agriculture dollar doesn't affect everybody. I had 50 sows here in '98. Well, when '98 came, they started squeezing a lot of family farmers out, and I lost a lot of my customers. I was struggling. I went to the bank over there to borrow some money, and it was hell. And the guy says to me, you're spending money like a drunken sailor. And I went in there and I told him what I was spending my hog. I sold some hogs and I spent money on feed, vet, things that I needed. I didn't squander it. And he says to me, you're spending money like a drunken sailor. And I had tears in my eyes. And he said, well, I needed to borrow $1,000. He said, I'll give you $1,000, but it's got to be paid in 30 days. I went home. I was madder than hell. And I decided I was not, I could see that the prices of everything was going to hell. Everything was going to hell. And I knew that other farmers had been suffering and lost their farms. And I said to Mom, I said, this ain't going to happen. I'm not going to allow myself to go deep in debt anymore because of the hog factories running me. I'm not going to let them, I'm not going to take that chance. I'm not going to go $25,000 in debt or $15,000 in debt just to buy God, just to try to hang on.
For many crops, the United States has been the price leader, the global price leader, the ones who sets world prices for some major things. We had 90% of the market, of the export market share for soybeans for some years, and very high for quite a period of time, as much as 70% for corn, for example, in the export markets. And so we were setting those prices. Rice also, it was said that we actually set that market price globally. And so when we lowered the price lower down, then that global price was lowered down. So the United States chose to reduce the parity programs, reduce our management of the supply, have more carryover, more oversupply, and lower our market prices. So basically, the big agribusinesses lobbied Congress so that the United States would lose money on our exports for their benefit. And many of these were multinational corporations, so they would benefit with cheap prices in the United States and also cheap prices globally.
It's one of the things that really are missing in today's agriculture, because we have such a focus on technology instead of human knowledge, the knowledge that we've gained by just doing something, by actually living on the land and living with the animals, the plants, seeing the seasons come and go. Those are really important aspects of farming, producing food, and then just being connected, not just connected, but having a relationship with nature. I think, some people are afraid of change, but yet what we have now is like drudgery. I mean, who would want to, certainly some people are attracted to like the technology of agriculture right now, but in the sense that the technology is replacing farmers, and it's replacing the connection, the joy, the real reason that we're the reasons that we're here on the farm.
You got big business, you got the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, you got the Farm Bureau, which is pro-business, it's a big insurance company. You got the commodity groups, which now is bought into this free trade baloney. People are discouraged and upset and everything else, and so that's what the grassroots movement's all about, is getting some economic justice, not only for family farmers but for everybody.
Jourdan is one of the last small towns in Greene County that has kept their school, but they've had to scale back, and so their senior high kids, a lot of them will go down to Jefferson, to our county seat, to the bigger school to take science classes and things like that. And they've had to abandon their sports programs here in Greene County, in Jourdan. One interesting thing is here in Jourdan, they've always had their own water system. They were getting water out of wells and piping it to all the houses, of course. And but year after year, they found that their water quality was so low, especially in terms of the nitrate levels, that it wasn't safe to be pumping it around to houses anymore. So they had to get their water from what's called a rural water district that pumps water from big deep wells and sends it all over several counties actually. And it's turned out that the cost of the water now is so high in Sheridan that people are moving out just because of the cost of their water. So that is just crazy to have their water source become polluted by the dominant industry.
When we lost the Parity program, started losing the Parity program in '53, they started ratcheting it down. I now can say I could see what happened with the small towns. Things started collapsing around the small towns. Some of the small towns shut their doors. And then some of the big chain stores was moved into Marshalltown. So family farmers went there because things were cheaper there through the big chain stores compared to the family home stores here. Okay, so that's kind of what happened. You know, when we lost that purchasing power, we had to go somewhere else to make up for all that stuff. And consequently, that's why some of the small towns started drying up. We just have a post office now and a tavern, and I think there's a repair shop in town, but that's just about it. We don't have a school. We have one church, and it's practically gone now. We had 5 churches. So it's a figment of what it used to be.
Well, I mean, it's really devastating for a family to leave their farm, lose their farm. Everybody in the family is involved on a family farm. And of course, young people, they want to be like grandpa. They want to be farmers too, and like their dad. And farm kids are learning all kinds of things on the farm. So they value that kind of life. And the farmers and the whole farm families not only has a financial investment in the farm, but they have a huge psychological investment in the farm, a tradition that goes way back sometimes. And so it's a very huge psychological blow to a family that is going to leave their farm.
It's all about, you know, solidarity. Capitalism does not teach solidarity. It's been happening all over. I mean, there's suicides going on in India. There's suicides going on all over the planet. You know, when you take away, people don't understand this. That once you commit yourself to this, it's like your home, and you're wedded to the land. People don't understand what that means, and that's why people get broken up, because when they love farming, and then something happens, they lose their farm. It's just like losing your soul. It's like losing your family. I think that's what the deal is about family farming, is being able to make your decisions, and you got the freedom here and the fresh air and stuff like that. That's what makes agriculture such a wonderful thing for families. That's why it's so important to get folks back out here on the land.
And so now in 2022, we look at how farming is in the United States, and because it was so cheap to raise livestock in big confinements, to buy all their feed, they could just get on the computer and order millions of bushels of corn, for instance, to feed thousands and thousands of chickens or cattle. The livestock is owned by big corporations. It's being fed by big corporations, and the family farmer doesn't even have a chance to raise livestock anymore. And so now the farmer is stuck with the only options of raising corn and soybeans over and over and over and over, which is an environmental disaster in the making. You can tell it's eliminated a lot of our wildlife, a lot of biodiversity. And it's polluted our drinking water. So this is a very bankrupt system that you have when you don't have parity.
And parity then would mean that we'd be thinking differently about how we produce the food, what foods we produce, how we connect with nature, how we think about those sort of things as well. How we think about living on this earth, because there's so many things about the industrial agriculture is, unfortunately, it's destroying our earth, it's destroying society, our cultures.
We need a system that guarantees minimum prices for our products, a guaranteed minimum price, so that we could stabilize our agriculture and stabilize our rural communities on the one hand, and then have a parity wage, a living wage that is adjusted for inflation.
Parity is a standard of fairness, a standard of economic distributed farm justice, and in one sense it's like a living wage standard. In parity we have price floors, and the price floors are set high enough so that the farm price will be at what would be called a living wage, or 100% of parity farm price. That's the traditional standard. And so it's a kind of economic distributed farm justice. Well, one thing I would add here at the end is that we had, when you have the parity farm programs, that also helps the black farmers. That's a huge help for the black farmers. We saw that when we lowered it down, we had a huge reduction of the black farmers. And as opposed to that little time during the parity years, that smaller time when they actually had an increase in the number of full and part owners. So this loss is huge. Women farmers, they need the parity programs. They're very strong supporters of it. The black farmers, they were very strong supporters of the parity programs. We have that from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the leading black farmer group in the United States, and they've had offices all across the South. Beginning farmers, how are you going to help beginning farmers if you don't fix what has led to the loss of the beginning farmers and the aging of farmers, which all happened with the lowering of the parity down, the lowering of the price floor. Some people refer to this as dumping as the big mean United States hurting other countries, but I argue that and the family farm movement sees that as the United States losing money, as opposed to, we're losing money to subsidize other countries in effect, but also at the same time hurting their farmers in our program. That's not something people here would support if they knew about it. So we've been working through our social movements, to the family farm movement, to bring that to people's attention.
Well, I've said, and I've said it so many times with other folks, that this is all the family farmers all over the world. It's our fight. We can't be bidding against those folks. We can't be dropping our cheap corn on their markets.
So oftentimes there are many arguments against parity. And it's all based on misinformation, on misrepresenting what parity really is. Because parity, for instance, is just a matter of that the farm prices are supported, like a minimum price, just like in the farmers in India demanding a minimum support price. That doesn't cost the government anything. It's a matter of whether the people buying the product pay a fair price or not.
As it is, individual countries are not allowed to set prices for their farmers, and I can't tell you the exact details on how that works, but free trade, open markets, allowing farm products to be imported into your country are part of the World Trade Organization's rules. And so we can't really have parity. That is, here in the United States, we wouldn't be able to have parity, and other countries wouldn't be able to have parity unless we change those rules. Food does connect us all. I think that's really valuable aspect for me, that knowing that there's people like doing the same things that I'm doing all around the world, and that we have the same concerns. We have to deal with labor, and we have to deal with, the weather and markets, and how we're going to sell the produce, if it's going to look good, if it's going to be what needs to be done, what it needs to be. So there's a lot of things like that that I think is important about connecting with other farmers and food producers around the world. And we are connected. We're connected politically, and we're connected spiritually, in a sense, because that's what we do.
So the idea was to set up a commission which would determine what is the agriculture price or the minimum support price a farmers must get. And so the mechanism of evolving a minimum support price for staple food crops was evolved. And secondly was when the production is too much, or when the production increases, there has to be a mechanism to ensure that whatever arrives in the markets at the time of the harvest is mopped up. And for that, the government set up what is called as the Food Corporation of India, with twin objectives of one, mopping up everything that comes into the mandis, and secondly, to distribute the surplus grain in the areas which were deficient in food production. The global economic design that has been cast, or that is where the entire agriculture is aimed at, or the objective is to see that agriculture operates in that stream, is actually based on sacrificing agriculture for the sake of industrial growth. Now, this is what began in America, this is what the European Union followed, and this is what is now being forced on to developing countries like India. It began in America. The movement against, or the movement for seeking a guaranteed price, which is called income parity in the American language, began in America. Several decades back, farmers were protesting. They also had a huge tractor protest in Washington, D.C. And if the governments in America had listened to their farmers so many decades back, I'm sure the global agriculture would have been on the right pathway. When I say right pathway, I'm talking about sustainability as well as economic viability for the farm sector. This didn't happen, and the world was made to follow that design, and we see agriculture devastated all over the world, India being no exception. I think we need to understand that everyone needs an assured income. Whichever profession you are, you need an assured income. Why is it that it's only agriculture produce that comes into the market without a price tag? And the markets then decide what should be the price for this commodity. That is the result we have seen all across the world, that because there is a no price tag fixed for agriculture produce, agriculture has been ruthlessly exploited by the markets or by the trade. And that is what has pushed farmers out of agriculture, or has forced them to commit suicide, if that is just an inkling of the kind of distress that prevails. In a country like India, where 50% population is involved or dependent on agriculture, I think providing the rightful income for the farmers is the surest way to make agriculture a very important, or let's say the second powerhouse of economic growth. First being the industry, second being agriculture. The way the WTO is still under pressure to remove agriculture subsidies from the rich countries is a clear example that if the markets were so wonderful or so benevolent, I'm sure there would have been no need for rich countries to provide massive subsidies for agriculture. I think what we need is that every country should become food self-sufficient, and for that we must ensure that they get the rightful income. India has to learn that we do not blindly follow the American model of agriculture or the Western model of agriculture, which has devastated farming in those countries and which will add on to the severe crisis that already prevails in India. What India needs now is to make MSP a legal mechanism, which means it ensures that, as I said earlier, no trading takes place below the benchmark that has been ascribed by the minimum support price, and then we allow the markets to operate. I think it is time that we are able to leave it behind, that part of history behind us, and enact new provisions which can make agriculture an instrument of economic growth. In India, a Prime Minister called Mr. Charan Singh, and he used to say, and often he would say, that a farmer in India is born in debt and dies in debt. I wasn't surprised when an American farmer, during the time when there was a huge protest in India by the farmers last year, told me that in America too, farmers are born in debt and they die in debt. In fact, he added on to it by saying that if you really want to know what hell is about, then I think the best way to know is if you become a farmer in America. I think the lessons that we need to draw is very clear, that when the American farmers protested in 1979 in Washington DC, marching into the city with the tractors and staying there for a few months, they were asking for, or they were demanding, income parity. And the protests that happened in India last year were also demanding guaranteed prices. Income parity and guaranteed prices being the same in mechanism or the same in intention, I think it should be clear that both American farmers and the Indian farmers are at the same level of distress because of the same kind of mechanisms that have prevailed over the last few centuries, or even decades is easy to say, but I think even 1.5 century or so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that both the extremes, the United States and the Indian farming populations, have the future hinging on providing a guaranteed price, or what is called as income parity. I think this is where the world has to now stand up to and listen to the demand of the farmers. We cannot go on ignoring this for long. You cannot go on penalizing farmers to produce food, because when we deny farmers the rightful price, we actually penalize him to produce food.
A movement that has wonderful people in it, and we want them, we family farmers, we want them on our team, and we have this message to teach them that they have not shown that they understand yet. So that's where things are at today. There's hope, but it involves people who are already working on Farm Bill issues learning the extra part about parity as this multi-trillion-dollar operating system that affects dozens of issues.
What we have to do is communicate to our fellow citizens how important parity is, so that they can demand that we have a government that does serve farmers and is based on parity for everybody.
I think it's wonderful that you folks are doing this, because the story has to be told. The history of family farming, the history of the labor movement, the history of the women's movement is so important in bringing solidarity to everybody. So it's wonderful, that young people are out there taking an interest in this, because we've been at it for a long time. It's been since the 80s. Brad's a firebrand. He does more technical stuff than I do on the computers and stuff, and he does a lot of work. So it's been good knowing Brad and George. So that's what keeps me going, So we just need to get more farmers involved. That's the big struggle. We got such a great propaganda machine out here that, trying to divide us and trying to stop us from getting a fair price, that it's pretty tough. But I think we can prevail if we can get our story out there. That's important.
Just ain't efficient, selling below our costs. The profit ain't competitive, from each bushel it is lost. It's lost from our farm, dragged communities down, I say. Our state gets took, and so does the good old USA. They claim it's all for freedom, free markets and free trade. It's supposed to build up exports, and then we'll have it made. But Reagan's evil empire, nations everywhere, get subsidized below our costs on every export there.